Good afternoon. David, thank you for inviting me to be here tonight. It's great to see all these young faces. And by the way, I'll let you on a secret. I'm here to recruit people for the Euromemo group, the way we recruited David years ago. We need to sort of, Pascal is here with us. He's one of the old guard, and Pascal Petit, of course. And bit by bit, the old guard is retiring, and we definitely hope that younger people, younger economists, social scientists will be inspired and join us. David already said a number of things about the Euromemo. I shall just say that it's been going on for something like 30 years, which is quite remarkable because it's an association that relies on members' fees and perhaps some kind of donations from institutions like the Poulantzas Institute in Greece, which is a think tank. There is a Luxembourg Institute in, well, across the world really, and so on. What we do is we organize an annual conference sometime in September, and this is followed by the publication of a report which appears usually in the early spring of the following year, and which is based on the proceedings of the conference. The 2026 conference is going to take place in mid-September, and it will take place at the Oxford Brookes University in the UK. Our conferences, since we have very few funds, our conferences are hosted by different universities across Europe who offer to do so. They want to contribute to the discussions of critical economics and social science, so they offer to host the conference. Next year, it's going to be in the UK, Oxford Brookes University. There will be an announcement, a call for papers early next year. How does this work? Sorry. The title of my presentation is the title of the latest publication of the Euromemo, Europe and the World Beyond the Polycrisis. I'm saying this because what I've done is to update it a little in two major areas, but we shall see this shortly. This is the outline of what I'll be speaking about and try to make it in 45 minutes. Start with the EMG as a collective public intellectual. Then, by way of introduction, discuss the notion of polycrisis and the concept of discussing possible futures in view of uncertainty. Then we go on to the main part of the presentation, which is the place of the EU in the global order, the initiatives, which is competitiveness via simplification, aka deregulation, militarization, the second major area where we have developments in the EU, the US-EU trade agreement, which impacts on all of those, on both of those areas that I just mentioned, and then we come to the scenario exercise, which is actually in the report that I showed you just a minute ago. I have uploaded the report, the actual report. You can find it in the EPOG site, okay? So it's there for you to read in detail. And of course, we have to end by coming back to reality. Okay, starting with the EMG as a collective public intellectual, I'm sorry. Now, an intellectual, and this is a definition that comes from a dictionary, but I thought it was quite comprehensive and interesting to quote. So it's a person who engages in critical thinking, research, and reflection about the nature of reality, especially the nature of society, and proposes solutions for its normative problems. It actually does describe, to a large extent, what we try to do. And it's public because this work is presented in a way that is made accessible to the wider public, to people who don't necessarily do research or attend universities or work in those areas. So it has to be accessible, and when that happens, it becomes public. The EMG is a collective public intellectual because As I said a minute ago, our work is based on the proceedings of conferences usually attended by 60 to 70 people. The actual report is written by something like 10 people, exchanging views and discussing, and then coming up with a final draft. One has to be wary of the new age public intellectuals. New age because there is the connectivity and the immediacy of social media platforms has given rise to the breed of influencers. Now, influencers is okay, you know, they bring up issues. However, there are the so-called rogue influencers, and one has to be wary of those. One has to be very careful what adopts from, you know, what you read on the internet. So our paradigm tries to combine academia and activism. We do have close relations with social movements and trade unions, social media. We are present on the social media. In fact, right at the top of this slide, you see the address, https, yeah, it's wrong there, euromemo.eu. If you just type euromemo.eu, you'll get there. Okay, polycrisis. This is a term in vogue. It was not invented by Jean-Claude Juncker in 2016. However, it was popularized by Juncker. It may be as a matter of courtesy, he was invited by the Greek Industrialist Association in Athens, and in his speech, he actually referred to the Greek word polycrisis, as he said it, to describe the situation in 2016. And what he has in mind is the security threats in Europe, refugee crisis, and the UK referendum, Brexit. Well, UK referendum has just taken place in 2016. So he actually points out, and this is the interesting bit, that these crises of 2016 feed each other and create a sense of doubt and uncertainty in the minds of our people. It's a succinct definition, a succinct approach. The term polycrisis has stuck in economic parlance, and you will find a much more recent definition by Eric Helleiner, 2024, which in fact does not deviate from what Juncker said in 2016. What is added by Helleiner is the last bit, that the realization of what a polycrisis is encourages scholars to analyze interconnections between different kinds of crises across various issue areas. In other words, if you're studying digitalization, which was a very interesting presentation, I didn't follow all of it, but the last bit when I came in, you have to realize that it's linked to other things, other areas of policy. And therefore, at some point, one has to see the whole and make out which is greater than the parts that make it up. Indeed, the term has informed many of our reports. Starting in 2023, Europe in Polycrisis struggles for survival, climate, and energy justice. It was just after the war in Ukraine. 2024, how should the EU cope with the polycrisis? And of course, 25, Europe and the world beyond the polycrisis, possible futures. You see, we've overdone it with the word polycrisis, but it's there. So this is, part of what we're discussing tonight. Possible futures. I would like to actually here put a doubt in our minds. Do we know the future? Can we know what will happen when we get out of this room? Okay, probably rain, probably the bus will be late. We'll get home, have our dinner, watch TV, Netflix or whatever, do some work. We're fairly certain in our minds, but you could also be run over by a bus. Touch good. Anything can happen. Now the thing is, and this is to Keynes' credit, he brought in the concept of uncertainty as a formal concept. What he said was that since to the extent that you cannot actually attach precise probabilities of risk probabilities to an event, a possible event, then you don't know it. So the future is basically unknowable in this sense. It is a lack of knowledge, especially about the long run. This is just to bear in the back of our minds and probably be modest about foreseeing things. Our memorandum does include 5 scenarios. I don't want to spend more time on this. It starts from the bad. It starts from the pretty bad. It goes on to the less bad, scenario 2, then to a good scenario, scenario 3, and then 4 and 5, placing everything in a global context. But we'll talk about this when we come to it. Okay, so a new global order is in the making. I don't think anyone would dispute that. US-China hegemonic rivalry, we can see it, read about it, manifestations everywhere. There's an emerging multipolar world, including regional powers. It is not the unipolar that we had after the end of the Cold War. We still have at this point, we have a multipolar world. There are regional powers, Russia, India, and so on. Niche powers, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is trying to make its mark. You've probably been following the news with the visit of the Saudi Arabian prince to the States, and the reception that he has received from Trump, who's prepared to overlook everything that Saudi Arabia and the particular person is blamed with. So there's this transition, which means basically competition for resources, technology, political influence, and this is a potential for conflict. This competition breeds conflicts. Trump's Make America Great Again dogma heightens the antagonism, and his shift to populist ultra-right-wing politics makes things even worse. Now, where is the EU in all this? The role of the EU is often neglected. It is less unified, obviously, made up of 20 member states. It speaks with multiple voices. It wouldn't be the first time you have Germany basically disagreeing with everyone else, or Germany and France disagreeing, and so on and so forth. It's a long list. And it's closely linked to the US. This is a legacy from the Second World War. It's relied on the US for a large number of things since the end of the Second World War. So, could we call the missing third power? This is an expression used by Babbage and other authors in a very interesting publication, The Political Economy of Geoeconomics. If we look at the data, just a few numbers, the European Union does appear to be a middling power, a power that has tied its economy to the fate of the rest of the world buying its goods and services. Okay? It exists on surplus, trade surplus. It is intent on fiscal austerity, even at the cost of its potential place in the international order. Just some basic data. To make the best sense of this, to start from the, as you look at it from the last column on the right, and you can see that right down at the bottom, the EU has a lower public debt rate compared to GDP amongst the three powers, let's call them, the three areas, US, China, by comparison to the US and China. Same, and even more strongly, is the case with public deficit. Again, the EU public deficit, that's the whole of the EU, is less than half of that of the US and of that of China. The current account, and that's why one says that it depends on other people buying its goods and services. The current account has a surplus as opposed to a deficit in the US, and a much larger surplus than China. Unemployment rate, higher unemployment rate, and perhaps one would not be surprised to look at this, to see this. Interestingly, it has some like 30% more greater population than the US, far lower, far less than China. Its share of GDP is, interestingly, about the same as that of the US, and less than that of China. And last but not least, it seems to be growing at a very low rate of growth, which is what's worrying the European leaders. Out of all these figures, it's the low rate of growth of the EU by comparison to the US and China that is worrying them most. Now, I put up the figures for 2024. They're not, they depict a situation that's been going on for quite a number of years. In 2024, there was the Draghi report that I'm sure most of you have heard about. And Draghi wrote, with his team, wrote a voluminous report, 2 volumes, with general recommendations and sectoral recommendations. Although a lot of the stuff in that report is interesting and worth taking into account in understanding how the EU works, the EU economy, and what may be wrong with it, from the critical point of view, a number of criticisms must be made before we actually go on to see what's happening with Draghi. So supply-side economics, nothing surprising there. His recommendations, very, very briefly: cut down red tape, liberalize capital markets, uniform implementation of regulation of member states, assertive foreign trade policy. This, in fact, these remarks, these comments come from publication by Werner Reiser, who used to be on our steering committee for quite a number of years. The productivity, in discussing productivity, Draghi seems to not realize or underestimate the importance of working conditions and of wages. In recommending subsidies, he overlooks the fact that subsidies should be tied to social conditionalities. I give you this amount of money, but then you also undertake to, I don't know, raise employment or make sure your workers have got the right training and all kinds of conditionalities, none of those in Draghi's recommendations. Innovations, well, regulations do stimulate innovation. They're not all bad. They have a cost, but they also have a benefit. That's why people want them. The constraining effects of EU fiscal rules on public spending are again overlooked in the report. When it talks about public investment, there is a suggestion that there might be common borrowing, but there is not an actual recommendation. Draghi is being very careful. He knows that common borrowing meets with a lot of objections from a number of countries. Therefore, he has not recommended that. Defense spending, he's all for defense spending, although that may well work out at the expense of social and green public spending. Again, he underestimates the dependencies on the US and China. And last but not least, he appears to ignore the global south aspect of Europe's climate debt, climate problems. Okay, so a year later, after the report came out, in September this year, there was a high-level conference. The conference was about what has happened since the publication of the Draghi report. The points I put up are actually from Draghi's own intervention. And so Draghi there points out that a year later, 3 challenges are still there as they were a year ago. The growth model seems to be under strain. Dependencies on the US for exports in China for critical materials are still there. And the EU has not delivered on climate, digital, and security goals. So he goes forward and sets 3 priorities: closing the innovation gap, charting decarbonization while supporting growth, strengthening economic security. And he concludes that a different path requires new speed, scale, and intensity. Scale and speed, it's about state aid, procurement, competition consolidation, lower barriers. Intensity is about deeper reforms and growth of EU capital markets. Financing. In the report in 2024, he shied away from recommending common borrowing. This time, he points out that for all of these recommendations to take place, a year later, a greater sum of money would be needed by comparison to a year ago, 1,200 as opposed to 800 billion for the period 25 to 31. He also estimates that 43% of that should come from the public budgets. And he also, interestingly, he recommends the coalition of the willing. In other words, if there's a common project that a number of countries are interested in putting forward, then they may go out and produce common debt. it's not easy, actually. When you look at how financial markets work, that's not going to be, to my mind, it's a non-runner. But it does sound good in terms of what Draghi is trying to tell us. Okay, so Draghi said whatever he said, 24, he comes back 25, says it again. What has happened on the ground? What has actually taken place in relation to the response of the EU Commission, the EU authorities? Well, as I said at the beginning, in presenting the outline of the presentation, two areas. One is competitiveness via simplification. This is interesting. They identify the meaning of competitiveness with simplification in quotes. Why in quotes? Because it's basically deregulation. We could call it deregulation and make sure that we all understand the same thing. If anything, there is no distinction between what is red tape, what is a regulation that needs to be held on to, what is a regulation that is a burden and therefore can be rid of. This is a point raised by the Economist statement, which I also uploaded for your benefit. So, in November 2024, the European leaders, the European Council, had a meeting in Budapest, and they produced the Budapest Declaration, where they say that we're on a crusade against red tape. Makes you think of knights in shining armors fighting the red tape. And what do they mean by that? Well, we have to launch a simplification revolution, nothing less than a revolution, to ensure a clear, simple, and smart regulatory framework for businesses and drastically reducing administrative, regulatory, and reporting burdens. Now, allow me a personal note. As a person who was involved in the discussions with the Troika, that was the ECB, the European Commission, the ESM, back in the years of the SYRIZA government, I can tell you that if they could eliminate, well, if they could eliminate as many regulations, as many obstacles to the policies they wanted Greece to adopt, they would have done it. They were very happy to just say, push for more and more things to go, to disappear. So I get, reading this document, the Budapest Declaration, I get the same feeling. If you read it, and I do recommend that you read it, it's good to read the actual documents produced by the powers that be. You will probably agree with me, you may not, which is obviously makes it quite interesting. But the thing is, reading that document makes you feel that it's all out. You know, they really have a goal which is to eliminate as much as possible of the regulatory framework for which the EU is famous for. And in practical terms, omnibus package, amending Corporate Sustainability Requirements Directive and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which means softening the obligations of the companies, reducing compliance requirements for businesses operating in the EU, limiting the number of businesses within scope. And there's another omnibus regulation, which allows private capital to draw on InvestEU funds. These rules will be transposed into national legislation by July 27 and become operational as of 28. So it's ante portas, it's right ahead of us. That's the statement I already mentioned, which again, I recommend that you read it because it's a very well thought out statement, clearly disputing the fact that the growth dip and the decline of the European economy is due to a lack of competitiveness. It is due to structural and political factors. Even the Financial Times, Martin Sandbo, has come forward in an article of his fairly recently, November the 2nd, saying that a simplistic view that too many rules hold European growth back is being uncritically internalized. There are some activities we do not want to grow. That's why we have regulations. The other area where things have been happening, not nice things, is militarization. And I call it contemplating warfare. What, is that too much? Is that too hard for you? Well, we have increasing rearmament. We have increased defense spending. We have policies turning towards warlike, like I was reading that investment, there's the military Schengen area to be set up. In other words, so that tanks can cross Europe without being stopped at the borders. So you do have this warfare sort of feeling if you look at the documents. I mean, we haven't seen the tanks somewhere on our borders yet, which is good. However, people who are in power, who are in government, are thinking about these things. Charles Michel, he was the president of the European Council in 1924, and he said the EU must prepare for war, okay? He was ready to take arms. And von der Leyen, in her State of the Union address in September this year, European defense and security is the second key priority among 6 key priorities. In March, the Rearm Europe plan, or Readiness 2030, actually was decided. And then the plan is about funding. Mobilize 800 billion over 4 years, of which 150 billion will come from joint borrowing and 650 from national budgets. This is the SAFE, Security Action for Europe, loan instrument. Interestingly, all this was decided without the Parliament actually approving it. It never went to the Parliament for decision. The second funding source, national escape clause. Okay, so the fiscal framework which was put into effect in 24 is being reshaped to a certain extent, exempting increased spending on defense up to 1.5% of GDP from the annual spending limits of the Stability and Growth Pact for 4 years. Notice the 4-year period, 25 to 28. At the end of the 4-year period, if you have contracted a loan, if you've gone out to the financial markets and issued bonds to pay for your defense spending, for your increased defense spending, even though the deficit incurred because of that during the 4-year period is not taken into account, you're not penalized for that, the debt, the increased debt remains after 2028. So you will have some problems. The third source, the multi-annual financial framework, 28 to 34, which is currently under discussion and negotiation. And what we already see when we examine what's happening and the discussions and the figures put forward, there's a clear prioritization of defense spending. And the Capital Markets Union, which has been in the making for a long time now, and it's to tap savings accounts in banks. War economy mode. I said warfare in the previous slide. War economy mode, this is the expression of Ursula von der Leyen. In presenting the European Defence Industrial Strategy and Technological Industrial Base, which was just last October, she explained these initiatives in terms of the EU getting into a war economy mode. By the way, these have been approved by the European Parliament. What are the goals of these strategy? Well, reducing fragmentation in European defense industry, reducing weapons imports, so that 50% of EU countries' defense procurement comes from the European defense technological industrial base, and 35% is intra-EU. The implications, I already mentioned the fiscal squeeze after 2028, especially for highly indebted countries. The reordering of priorities, which we saw just a minute ago, which also includes the repurposing of funds from cohesion to defense. The IMF has very recently, on the 4th of November this year, published a note saying, well, to deal with the increased defense spending, radical fiscal measures will be needed, and I quote here, potentially affecting the social contract. In other words, there will be protests from the people who suffer the consequences, and therefore the European countries' leaders might need to rewrite it to convince people that this is for their benefit. This is a big table. Just look at the red figures, the red countries. What you see there is that countries that have a high debt, public, am I over the time? countries like Belgium and Spain, they already have high public debt. They have a low rate of defense spending in relation to GDP. So if they're going to raise their defense spending, they will need to either divert resources from other areas to defense, or raise taxation, or borrow. And if they borrow, they're already far over the limit of the 60% of the Stability and Growth Pact, and therefore they will have a problem. So this table gives you an idea. On the other hand, look at Greece. Greece is the champion in terms of public debt in relation to GDP. It has a fairly high rate of spending on defense in relation to GDP, but it's something like second from the bottom in terms of GDP per capita. In other words, the Greek people are squeezed, are in a corner. Now, what do? You increase defense spending, and what do you do about social spending or any other kind of spending that might benefit the actual population? Stuck again. Okay, I take a sideways step and look at something that's not directly related, but it does impact what we have been discussing. The US-EU trade agreement that was contracted in July 2025. Von der Leyen actually went to Scotland and met Trump. So the first two quotes, the first 2 points, it's the way the European Commission presented the agreement and the way the White House presented the agreement. The von der Leyen, the press release, was very modest, saying, well, actually we had a challenging situation, we did our best, this is what we got for you, and it's okay, it's clear, it has restored clarity and coherence. So as if the problem was lack of clarity and coherence. The White House is enthusiastic, celebratory. The deal marks a generational modernization of the transatlantic alliance, will provide Americans with unprecedented levels of market access to the EU. Now this is interesting. It's not just, Trump's flourishing language. This is the actual announcement of the White House. And it does give you an idea of the different perspectives of the EU and the US, and the kind of relation between the two. If you look at the next paragraph, main elements of the agreement, there are more elements there, but these are some of the most striking ones. Elimination of EU tariffs on all US industrial goods, preferential market access for a wide range of agricultural goods, maximum US tariff regime for 15%, tariff rate quota for steel and aluminium, they're still working on this. EU, now notice, EU to procure US energy products, in other words, to buy from the US, valued at $750 billion, and invest $600 billion in the US by 2028. And EU to substantially increase procurement of military and defense equipment from US and to address undue restrictions on transatlantic trade and unjustified digital trade barriers. What I have in quotes comes from the actual agreement, not from the announcement of the agreement by either party, but from the actual agreement. So, I mean, I agree with René Repassi. I don't know the guy. He's a member of the European Parliament, a social democrat, when he wrote a piece saying, is this European strategy or is it subordination? I think it's the second, a bit more with the second rather than the first. This is an idea of what the trade between EU and US looks like. And as you can see, for the past 10 years, there's been a trade surplus in favor of the EU. In 2024, there was a deficit in services, so that reduced the surplus in goods, but it's still a surplus. And this shows the main exports of the EU to the US. Nearly 50% consists of medicinal and pharmaceutical road vehicles, general industrial machinery, electrical machinery. So some like 4 or 5 groups, categories of goods are 50% of all exports. Okay, I don't know what, yeah, I'm okay. So we come to the possible futures. Okay, our report has put forward 5 scenarios. You pick and choose. The first scenario, the EU disintegrates further. In other words, without EU fiscal policy, unified fiscal policy, the same for everywhere, what there is in place is a fiscal surveillance framework, which means that the EU has put forward 2 or 3 rules, and they say, okay, we will check that everyone is doing the same thing in terms of the result of their fiscal policy. How you get there, it's up to you. So there is no uniform fiscal policy, there is no uniform labor law, there is no uniform taxation system, and so on. Therefore, capital remains anchored on national interests. The national element is strong. That's what this is saying. And also, there is no EU-wide labor movement. Okay? Again, we know this in Greece very well. In the difficult years, the Greek unions had to struggle alone. National forces, therefore, prevail in the event of a crisis, depending on the timing and scale of the crisis. A really big crisis will strengthen all these tendencies, and the longer it goes on for, the worse it gets. That's the first scenario, which is pretty worrying. The second scenario, rising EU nationalism unites. So right now, it's Russia. For the EU and the European leaders, it's Russia. It's as if Russia is actually on the borders threatening to invade. So the common enemies unite, and the EU may become unified through militarization. This is what is being attempted right now. We'll have to wait and see how far it will go. So there may, even under the pressure of the EU nationalism, there may be more elements of a common fiscal policy, greater budget. The budget right now is around 1%, just over 1% of the EU GDP. Selective federal powers. This is not so bad. It's the first scenario with a modification towards some kind of unification. However, antagonisms may result in regional groupings, selective federalism. In other words, you may get the North European countries getting together, the Southern European countries or parts of them getting together. So indeed, you don't have a breakup as such, but you do have this regionalization. So it is equally a difficult scenario. Scenario 3, okay, the EU sees the light, and the alternatives propagated by associations like the Euro Memo are adopted as a federal EU moves away from its Eurocentric self-perception. I would add to this that it's the pressure in the streets that also makes a huge difference. It's the pressure of people going out to demonstrate and demand changes, radical changes in policy. So let's assume that scenario 3 assumes that the European leaders actually do concede, do realize that things cannot go on as they are, and therefore have to change for the better. Scenario 4, okay, now this brings the EU in within the global order. What it says here is it's influenced by not just the European, but also global movements. And as we said in earlier scenario 2, if there's a common threat, or if there's a common crisis, a crisis shared by many, that may act as a unifying force, and in fact, common hope of a better future may prevail. This has at times happened. You're too young to remember, perhaps the older people here might remember, the nuclear disarmament movement back in the 60s, which did have a result. Right now, there's a big movement in relation to the climate change crisis. So such movements may actually affect what's happening on the ground by the governments. Last but not least, the last scenario here actually builds on the previous one, on the fourth scenario, but it says, it places what may happen on a more kind of a stronger sort of, if you like, a more difficult case, like an impending disaster. I don't know. I mean, already we have climate flooding, we have floods, we have fires, wildfires, but the more these happen, the more the greater the pressure to change and to accommodate for such economic and ecological crisis, even wars. Again, this may be a unifying point. Okay, that's for the scenarios. As I say, they are in the memorandum of this year. You can look it up for more details. And come back to reality. And we need to carry on. The militarization and deregulation drive is unlikely to raise the competitiveness of the EU. On the contrary, Europe may become even more vulnerable vis-à-vis the US and China. What we do see happening already is a disciplinary union, a union that is adopting a war mode, not only towards an imaginary enemy, but also towards migrants, towards refugees, towards mass protesters. I don't know about France, I'm not sure. In Greece, a new law has been introduced, making it possible for the police to arrest mass protesters. The other day, 15 young people went to the center of Athens and opened up a banner against the militarization, and they were arrested, and they were taken to court and condemned to 9 months imprisonment, just for opening up a banner in Syntagma Square, the center of Athens. Now, this is a very new thing for us, because, I mean, you can demonstrate publicly if you have a different opinion to the one that's already there. But there you go. I understand in the UK, going on a mass protest, for example, against the Gaza, what's happening in Gaza, has by now is considered to be, terrorist gathering, and therefore the police intervenes. I don't know about France, but this idea of a disciplinary union is actually catching on in the EU, unfortunately. Authoritarian populism spreads as inequalities and popular discontent increase, and that goes along with everything what we've been saying until now. As a result, disintegrative tendencies may well emerge, and right now there's not such a nationalism on the European level, it's basically on the national level, but it may happen even on the European level, and we'll see what happens then. That's it. Thank you.